Namaskar, very good afternoon, good morning or good evening, depending upon which part of the world you are. आप सभी का PRL के अमृत व्याख्यान में स्वागत है, अभिनंदन है। A very hearty welcome from me, Anil Bharadwaj, for the PRL का अमृत व्याख्यान. This is the 17th व्याख्यान of the 75 episode series of व्याख्यान्स, which is being organized as a part of PRL's 75 years of legacy and history in fundamental physics and space sciences. Established in the year 1947 by father of Indian space program, Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, the PRL's Platinum Jubilee coincides with India's 75 years of independence. So it's a joint celebration of development of science and technology in India by PRL under the banner of PRL का अमृत व्याख्यान. Today's व्याख्यानकर्ता or the colloquium speaker for this 17th व्याख्यान is another distinguished scientist, and I should say distinguished biogeochemist, Professor Andrew Bowie from University of Tasmania. We thank Andrew for accepting our invitation and to be with us today when we are celebrating 75 years of PRL. So with this, I will now hand over to Dr. Vineet Goswami to introduce today's speaker. Vineet, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Bharadwaj, for welcoming the audiences to the 17th edition of the PRL का अमृत व्याख्यान. And it is a pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker for the 17th edition of PRL का अमृत व्याख्यान, Professor Andrew Bowie. Professor Andrew Bowie is a marine biogeochemist and chemical oceanographer whose research interests lie in understanding the biogeochemistry of trace elements in Southern Ocean and Antarctic sea ice environments. He is actively working in various projects that are addressing some of the important key research questions related to atmospheric dust deposition and solubilities, ocean iron fertilization, physicochemical speciation of trace elements and their isotopes, and the role of ocean dynamics on chemical and biological marine processes. His research outcomes are focused on assessment of trace element control of ocean productivity, ocean carbon sequestration, and expanding our understanding and knowledge of marine geochemical processes. Professor Andrew Bowie has been a recipient of several prestigious fellowships from the Australian Research Council. He has provided his leadership in several international chemical oceanographic research expeditions and has served as co-chair of the Scientific Steering Committee of the International Geotraces Program. With these words, I would now like to invite Professor Andrew Bowie to deliver his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vineet, and thank you all for the invitation to speak this evening and for your kind words of welcome. It's a pleasure to speak at this prestigious colloquium, and congratulations on 75 years of both the PRL laboratory and also the 75 years of independence. So I will share my screen now and trust that will work okay. Hopefully you'll be able to view my first slide. Somebody could confirm that.
We are able to see. We are able to see.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to talk for the next 45-50 minutes or so a little bit about my research, I guess, journey, specifically down here at the University of Tasmania, and how the science related to my field of research has evolved in the last 20 years, and to take a little bit of a historical look back at some of the projects we've been involved with and some of the knowledge gained, and talk a little bit about how that's come together within the International Geotraces program. And the title of the talk is Geotraces in Southern Ocean Iron Biogeochemistry, Where Have We Come? So just a little background to myself. I've worked at the University of Tasmania for 20 years. I relocated from the UK here in 2001 to go on an expedition to Antarctica. And the lure of the Southern Ocean and the lure of Australia was there, and I haven't left since. I've built up a research program here in Tasmania. We're at pretty much the bottom right end of the globe down here. Tasmania is an island off the southeast coast of Australia. It's geographically very well positioned for studying the Southern Ocean and Antarctica, but also has a lot of connections to the Indo-Pacific region, and a lot of the work is related to the major Australian continents. And we do a lot of our work in the Indian Ocean, the Southern Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. I work at an institute which called the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. We have 3 research centres, one focusing on oceans and cryosphere, one on fisheries and aquaculture, and one on ecology and biodiversity. We have 3 research themes: climate change, ocean earth systems, and ocean and Antarctic governance. And currently we have about 200 staff and 250 research high degree students. And that's expanding very fast. So moving on to my talk. So an outline of what I'll talk to you about, there'll be in 3 parts. The first part will be a little bit of a historical view on the work. I'll introduce the Geotraces program, the history of trace elements and isotopes in the ocean. And then I'll take us up to speed with the most recent release of the Geotraces intermediate data product 2021, which was released just last week in a couple of online webinars. I'll talk about 2 specific projects we led in the Indian sector of the Southern Ocean related to iron fertilization. The first is a Southern Ocean iron release experiment, which happened more than 20 years ago now, but was a pivotal moment for research into purposeful mesoscale enrichment of the Southern Ocean. And then I'll talk about a natural iron fertilization experiment, the Kerguelen Ocean Plateau Compared Study, and I'll explain what we've learned about iron biogeochemistry from those work. And I'll finally finish up with my most recent projects, which have largely been focused on atmospheric iron supply in the Australian region, and the linkages between earth, wind, fire, and pollution, and their impacts of atmospheric trace element supply and ocean productivity. So this will be a graph that will be familiar to most of you, but a little bit of history on the evolution of Earth's atmospheric CO2 balance. And we see here the graph going back from the year 2000 to about the year 800. And we can see that in the blue line, that's the atmospheric concentration of CO2. And it's more or less steady at about 280 parts per million until the Industrial Revolution in the mid 1800s. And since then, we've seen this hockey-like increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The blue line is data from Antarctic ice cores. The red line is the most recent data from the Atmospheric Observatory on Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And we see that the amount of atmospheric CO2 is rising very rapidly. And we know by the year about 2021, we're up to about 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is a big issue for us. Now, the inset here just shows this in a bit more detail. We show the ice core record, the Mauna record against the fossil fuel emissions, but we also show the delta 13 of carbon. And that's one of the isotopes of carbon that can be used to trace where that atmospheric CO2 is coming from. And we know in the burning of fossil fuels, and this is also shown in the Tring data, you get a decrease in the isotopic composition of delta 13 of carbon with the burning of fossil fuel emissions. So the 2 are closely linked. Now, why is that important for the work we did? Well, it largely comes from a paper published in Nature in 1999 Petit et al., who published this is from Antarctic ice cores as well, published the CO2 in the atmosphere record, but also linked it to the changes in the temperature of the Earth over the history of the Earth. So along the x-axis here, this is the age in thousands of years before the present time. And they were also able to link it to the amount of dust that was in the atmosphere and deposited to Antarctic ice cores over this period. And the key thing to show here is that if you have these waves of atmospheric CO2 going from, as I say, about 280 parts per million, which was the pre-industrial level, down to much lower concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, and these correlated with low concentrations of temperature. And you see there's these various waves where we go from these higher levels to these decreases or these minimum in CO2 where we have cooler temperature of the Earth. Interestingly to note, where we tend to have these cooler and low CO2 periods, we tend to have higher concentrations of dust. Correlation isn't always there, but largely you see lower temperature, lower CO2, higher concentration of dust. And these oscillations go back over several thousands of years. And the key thing about dust is that one large component of dust is the element iron. Iron is about 5.6% abundance in the Earth's crust. So about 5% of dust contains iron. So this led us to the hypothesis of does iron from the continents, from dust, fertilize the ocean and result in a decrease in the CO2 in the atmosphere and a decrease in temperature. And I'll come on to that a little bit more in the second part of my talk. But that sort of puts a bit of a background on a lot of the work I've done and links it all together. So Geotraces, I'll move on to Geotraces now. This was an international program we established. We first started discussing it in the early 2000s, but it was established in 2010. And it was largely brought about by a lot of new measurements of trace elements and isotopes in the ocean, and iron was one of those key elements that we were measuring. And it was designed to bring labs together, to bring the international community together to produce these high-quality data sets where we could measure and observe the concentrations and distributions of trace elements and isotopes in the ocean and establish these sensitivity of these distributions to change in environmental conditions. That was the science plan produced in 2006. As I say, the focus of Geotraces was on key trace elements and nutrients. There were various programs before Geotraces which looked at the major nutrients, and there were very strong physical oceanographic programs in place, but none that looked at the key trace elements and isotopes. So you may ask, why are we interested in the key trace elements and isotopes? What do they tell us? Well, they act as micronutrients that control the ocean productivity and the structure of marine ecosystems. Key examples of those elements are iron, zinc, cadmium, copper, nickel, cobalt, and manganese. They also trace modern processes in the oceans. Elements such as aluminium can trace dust deposition. Rare earth elements can trace the internal lateral transfer of sediments, for example. Radium and thorium isotopes can be used to trace modern processes. Helium can be used as a tracer for water mass distributions, and nitrogen-15 can be used as an isotopic tracer for the history of some of the biological processes in the ocean. They can also be used as contaminants in the present and future ocean. We know lead, for example, from gasoline emissions can be traced in the ocean going back to the 1970s before it was eliminated from car and vehicle fuel. And we can use trace elements as proxies to reconstruct the past climate. So paleoproxies, 234 protactinium, 230 thorium are some examples, and some of the other ones are listed there too. In a context to why we looked at these trace elements and isotopes, we were primarily interested in 4 key interfaces between the ocean and the rest of the Earth system. So the ocean atmospheric interface, the ocean continental runoff interface, the ocean shelf sediment interface, and the ocean crust interface. And we were also interested in the cycling of these trace elements through processes such as uptake, regeneration, burial, and circulation. And this led us to run a series of workshops in the mid-2000s, one for the Pacific Ocean held in Hawaii, one for the Atlantic held in London, and one for the Indian Ocean held in Goa. And those workshops were designed to come up with a global map of proposed ocean sections to look at these key processes. And I've highlighted some of the key processes in our region and ones that we've studied as part of our projects. For example, atmospheric deposition from anthropogenic sources in the Indian Ocean, the very low dust inputs over the Southern Ocean, the intermediate water masses of the Southern Ocean, and also the hydrothermalism from ocean crusts. So we came up with these proposed ocean sections, and you'll see shortly that largely we've achieved our aims in that respect. So here we are. This is the snapshot of the Intermediate Data Product 2021. As I say, it was released last week. On this map of the global ocean, you'll see red lines, yellow lines, and black lines. The yellow and black are the completed sections. So you'll see we've got excellent coverage in most of the ocean basins, with only a few lines left to complete. And we've conducted some 130 cruises by 19 different countries. So it's truly an international effort to achieve this. And as you can see, doing a full transect of, for example, the Pacific Ocean is a major undertaking by any one nation. How has that resulted in an increase in the amount of data we've produced? Well, prior to Geotraces and prior to some of these international collaborative efforts, we were producing maybe only 10 or 50 or 100 data points for iron in all the world's oceans. This is where we were in the 1980s. By about the year 2000, international programs were on the international stage, increase in our observational programs, and by the time of the Geotraces launch, we were producing maybe 20,000 data points in the world's oceans. So an exponential decrease in the amount of iron in the world's ocean, and the present day value must be much higher than that. So historically, what do we know? Well, iron in the ocean, it was a bit of it was an extremely difficult element to measure. A lot of the early data was probably inaccurate due to issues with contamination, due to issues with the analytical technique. But by about the 1980s, we were beginning to produce the first reliable distributions of dissolved iron in the world's ocean. This is taken from the North Pacific. It was published in 1982. In the solid black line, you'll see the distribution of iron, and in the dashed line, that's the oxygen concentration in the ocean. And you'll see that we broadly have a nutrient type of distribution there. By nutrient, I mean that we have low concentrations of iron in the surface ocean. They increase in depth with regeneration processes. And we broadly have concentrations which are mostly look what they might be based on the biological need of iron. So in 1982, if you produced a profile for that, for dissolved iron in the ocean, that would probably get you a paper in the journal Nature. Things advanced rapidly from there, and some of those early profiles, through some of these early profiles, we were able to produce the first schematic representations of the processes governing the ocean iron cycle. Very simple processes that largely thought that dust was the major supply of iron to the remote ocean. Some of the iron in that dust was released. Phytoplankton would take it up through photosynthesis. That would pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Some different phytoplankton classes would also take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. They'd convert it to organic iron or organic phosphorus, which would create this particulate organic flux. That concentration would be set by a fixed ligand concentration. And some of the organic iron with the organic CO2 would be transported to depth, locked away for some tens to hundreds of years, and eventually brought up to the surface through upwelling. That was our very simple schematic of iron in the ocean. So this is a nitrate distribution in the Atlantic Ocean going from the Arctic to the Southern Ocean, and this was produced in 2006 by Measures et al. And as I say, there were international programs such as WOS and CLIVAR that were generating these large data sets for nitrate, but the capabilities weren't in place to produce trace elements and isotope data. So, for example, on this nitrate plot in 2008, sorry, all we can measure in terms of iron, and this was a big achievement at the time, but all we can measure in terms of iron was half of one ocean basin, so just here in the North Atlantic, only the surface to 1,000 meters, and only one ocean basin. And that was about the state of the art in the year 2000. Give you an example of where we come. This is a case study from some of the data from my research laboratory here. This is a Southern Ocean section called SR3. It's a repeat transect we ran from Tasmania down to the Antarctic ice edge. We ran it most recently in 2018. We've ran it 3 times since 2001, so we're able to produce a seasonal picture of the concentrations and distributions of trace elements and isotopes. And we're specifically focusing on the sources and the sinks, the water mass characteristics, dissolved particulate interactions, and the coupling of and decoupling of trace elements and nutrient cycles. So as I say, we've run it 3 times, the first in spring 2001. This is how we do it. So just some photos from our expeditions at sea. We use a trace element rosette to collect ultra clean seawater. We use a series of in situ pumps to collect marine particles. The rosette bottles are processed through Niskin filtrations to get our dissolved fraction. Suspended marine particles are collected there on filters and subsampled for subsequent laboratory analysis. And we also collect trace elements from the atmosphere. So there's photos of how we do it at sea. So in the early 2000s, in 2001, this is the data from the SR3 section. We had 8 stations, only the top 350 meters and a handful of data points. But this was reliable data and enabled us to undergo some bioassay experiments to determine whether iron is a limiting nutrient in that water. About 2008, we were able to produce the first ocean sections. This is section from Tasmania on the left-hand side here. This is dissolved iron, Antarctic on the right-hand side. And we're beginning to see some really interesting pictures. The limiting concentration of dissolved iron in the world's ocean, in the surface ocean, with some important sources of iron in the deep ocean, for example, in Antarctic bottom water around the Antarctic continent, but also around the mid-ocean ridges. And we're able to see a strong coupling of the trace elements with dissolved iron with the water masses. So, for example, where dissolved iron tends to outgas, or tends to outcrop, sorry, between about 60 and 65 degrees south. We also see that outcropping of salinity and dissolved oxygen, which is an indicative of upper circumpolar deep water coming to the surface. So we're beginning to see these strong correlations between trace elements and water masses. And by 2018, the most recent time we've run that section, we can see this very interesting hydrothermal signal above the southeast Indian Ridge at about 55 degrees south. And this hydrothermal signal is traced by dissolved iron, which maps really well onto dissolved manganese. That's the first time that's observed. And that work has just been published recently. So a lot of the work we do is pulled together by the International Geotraces program. I do encourage you to visit the website geotraces.org. It's a wealth of information and knowledge, but specifically to look at the Geotraces Intermediate Data Product 2021. It was released last week. It contains, it's a major new release. It contains significantly more data than contained in the previous data product of 2017. The important thing to note is this data is all publicly available. It's available to anyone. There is an online service where you can extract the data of interest. For example, if you're interested in only the Indian Ocean, extract that data. If you're interested in only one element or one particular section, you can use the data extractor to find that information of your choice. We have an electronic atlas, which has some specific graphics and visuals, which I'll show you shortly. And then we have the full IDP 2021 digital data, which is, available publicly to download. So how much data is included? Well, this map here shows the data that was included in the previous data product, IDP 2017, in blue, and in red, you'll see the new data in IDP 2021. And as you can see, a significant increase in the amount of data. We now have data for 570 different trace elements and isotopes. It's a huge amount of different parameters. We have much better coverage, in particular in the Indian Ocean. Look at the red data here, and also in the Pacific. This is all new data in red there. With a doubling of the cruises, a doubling of the station numbers, and a doubling of the data value counts. And more than 350 scientists globally were behind the data submission to this intermediate data product. As I say, it's a wealth of information, and we're highly valuable to modeling efforts going forward. Just an example of how you can access this data. This is the eGeotraces Atlas, so egeotraces.org will take you to this picture with all the different ocean basins. There's a little pop-down menu here where you can select your trace element of interest. In this case, I've chosen dissolved iron. If you then click on, for example, GP13, this was a zonal section we ran east of Australia out into the Pacific Ocean in 2011. If you click on that, it'll bring up the section of dissolved iron along that transect. You can see here some interesting features again, the hydrothermal plume above the Kermadec Ridge, iron being traced off the Australian continent here, and these very low concentrations out in the South Pacific. So that section will come up through the Geotraces Atlas. And if you're interested in any three-dimensional scenes of that, you just have to click on, for example, the Pacific Ocean here, and that'll take you to this three-dimensional view of the data that's been submitted so far to the International Data Product of dissolved iron in the Pacific Ocean. And there's some clear source signatures you can see in that data with multiple observations and profiles going right through to the Arctic part of the Pacific Ocean, right down into the Southern Ocean, some of the work we've done here south of Australia. So a very, very powerful database for people to access, and this is extremely valuable for teaching. I use this a lot in my classes. So by 2017, this was published by Bowie et al. In Nature in 2017. Our view on the major processes controlling the iron cycle in the ocean had changed. We have a much more complicated and detailed view of iron cycle in the ocean. We now know iron isn't just sourced from dust, it's sourced from sea ice and glaciers around the polar regions, it's sourced from mid-ocean ridges, it's sourced from marginal sediments. We also know that we move from iron limitation, which tends to be around in certain specific regions, but in particular the Southern Ocean, into nitrate and phosphate limitation in the tropics and the subtropics. Different phytoplankton classes are responsible for the cycling of nitrogen and carbon, and we have the organic iron and the organic carbon flux scavenged by variable ligand concentrations, and these are all brought together by the global thermal haline circulation transporting our trace elements or trace iron through the different global ocean basins. So multiple sources, sinks, and complex cycling. That's where we are by 2017. So that brings me to the end of the first part of my talk. I'm doing okay on time. Sets a bit of context for the work we do. I'm now going to talk about two specific ocean iron fertilization experiments we were involved with, going back over the last few years. So this map here is a satellite image of the mean annual chlorophyll concentration in the world's oceans. So it's well known this, as you can see around a lot of the continents, you have higher chlorophyll concentrations due to supply of nutrients and other elements that are needed for phytoplankton growth. You see some blooms around Antarctica, around South America here, up around the Arctic. But what's noticeable is that large areas of the world's ocean are blue. That means they're essentially ocean basins. In a lot of the subtropical and tropical regions, that's probably due to the limitation by major nutrients, nitrate, phosphate, and silicate. But in these southern regions here, around the Southern Ocean, the Equatorial Pacific, and the North Pacific, you also tend to get these low concentrations of chlorophyll. But if you look at the concentration of nitrate in the world's ocean, just jumping ahead here, so this is surface nitrate. These regions where you have low chlorophyll, you have relatively high concentrations of nitrate, and this is a bit of a paradox. You would expect where you've got high nitrate, high phosphate, high silicate, you would have more phytoplankton growth, higher chlorophyll biomass, because you had all the key nutrients that were needed for phytoplankton growth. However, what was missing from these regions, and this led to the iron hypothesis, it was thought that the element iron was missing, predominantly because these regions were very remote from continental land masses and they didn't receive iron from continental dust. So this led to a hypothesis, the iron hypothesis. One of the first people to put across the hypothesis was John Martin, and he quipped at a seminar in the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in the 1980s, I think. Give me half a tanker of iron and I'll give you an ice age. But it was a bit of with a bit of jest, but he was essentially saying that I think that dissolved iron is limiting the concentration, limited the growth of phytoplankton in the Southern Ocean and the Equatorial Pacific. And I know this from historical evidence that iron from deserts and dust has been transported to the ocean, has drawn CO2 out of the atmosphere and taken organic carbon to depth. That was his idea. It was largely based on a map of the atmospheric dust deposition to the ocean. So this is a compilation of different observations that were put into models in the start of the year 2000. And as you can see, there's relatively high deposition of dust around Africa in the sort of tropical and subtropical regions of the North Atlantic. But if you look at the Southern Ocean, very little dust transported to this region, or at least they thought there was. Some off South America, some off South Africa, and some off Australia, but relatively low compared to the African and sub-Saharan regions here. So I've shown this schematic already. This is the nitrate concentration in the world's ocean, and you'll see in the yellow boxes, these are the mesoscale iron enrichment experiments that were conducted. They're the purposeful addition of iron or an iron salt to the surface seawater with the aim of seeing a phytoplankton response and the drawdown of CO2. I'm going to talk about this experiment here, conducted south of Australia, the Southern Ocean Iron Release Experiment in 1999. It was the first Southern Ocean mesoscale experiment, and it paved the way for a lot of the follow-up work. And then I'll also move on to the Cheops experiments, two of those conducted in 2005 and 2011 with some French colleagues, and they were conducted around the Kerguelen Plateau in the Indian sector of the Southern Ocean. So first of all, to Soirée. So what we did is we found a patch of coherent water in the polar region south of Australia. We fertilized that patch with an iron sulfite solution on 4 different occasions, so shown by the black arrows here. An infusion of iron on day 1, on day 5, day 7, and day 5 and day 7. As well as adding iron to the patch, we added an inert tracer called sulfite hexafluoride. That was an easier way to track where the iron had been mixed into. And we also looked at various biological responses to that iron addition over the 14 days of the experiment. So with the photosynthetic competency, this gives an indication of how healthy the cells are in the system, where you see a photosynthetic competency A higher photosynthetic competency means the cells are relatively healthy. Where it's low, it means they're limited by some nutrient. We also tracked the integrated chlorophyll concentration, and we looked at the integrated primary production, rate of primary production. And you'll see after the addition of iron and the subsequent fertilizations, the cells became healthier, the photosynthetic competency increased, the integrated chlorophyll also increased, and the rate of primary production also increased over our 14 days. So the first test, the iron hypothesis, does iron increase phytoplankton growth and phytoplankton biomass in the ocean? This was proven correct over our experiment. These were transects of our research vessel across the study area. As I say, iron was also added with this trace of sulfur hexafluoride, SF6. And these lines here show SF6 along the top on the chlorophyll, and importantly PCO2. And where we have the elevated SO6 inside the patch, so the reds, and then sort of decreasing down to the yellows and the light greens, we see the increase in chlorophyll also mapped onto that. So within the patch, we've got an increase in chlorophyll A biomass. And we also saw that there was a drawdown of CO2. So the partial pressure of CO2 increased as CO2 was drawn from the atmosphere into the ocean. Interestingly, we tracked this. So we were in a study area for about a month, and then the ship had to return to port. But we tracked the bloom by satellite for about 2 months afterwards. And interestingly, we left the study area on February the 14th in 1999. But some almost 2 months later, on the 6th of April, we were still able to see this bloom, or this bangle-shaped bloom, in the same region we'd fertilized. So the bloom would become self-sustaining. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And we know that there was obviously sufficient iron by some recycling processes to keep that bloom growing long after we had left. So what were the key findings? Well, 4 additions of iron. We added 8 tons of iron as ferrous sulfate. We saw a 5-fold increase in phytoplankton biomass. This unexpected persistence of the bloom resulted in a 40 ppm drop in CO2, so CO2 drawn down from the atmosphere into the ocean. That equated to about 2,000 tons of CO2 uptake. But interestingly, we did not observe any export of that carbon. And that was probably because by the time we left the study area, 2 weeks after the fertilization, it was too soon to see the export. The bloom was still growing healthily some weeks later. So any export of the carbon associated with this bloom would have taken place long after we left. And as I say, we see this 6-week persistence of the bloom observed by satellite. And this resulted in a publication in 2001 in the article Nature, a mesoscale phytoplankton bloom in the polar southern ocean stimulated by iron. And I was one of the co-authors of our consortium of UK, New Zealand, and Australian scientists involved with that paper. So we learned a lot from Soirée, and there was many subsequent experiments which conducted similar work in different areas of the Southern Ocean, also with similar conclusive results. And in all, there were 14 iron fertilization experiments since 1993, but we sort of came to a bit of a hiatus when we were finding the results are fairly conclusive, but we weren't really able to extrapolate to the amount of carbon that were drawn down into the deep ocean. And that was because there were several sort of artifacts associated with iron fertilization experiments, which we couldn't really overcome. And they were, for example, that we provided an exceptional pulse of iron, a sort of unnatural pulse of iron, a large amount of iron over a very short period, be quite different to how iron would be transported to the ocean through, for example, internal processes upwelling or through dust deposition. And this resulted in an order of magnitude increase in the concentration of iron, which was, as I say, quite unnatural. There was no habituation of the phytoplankton bloom, and there was a net major loss of added iron. Some 80 to 95% of the iron we added was lost. So only a very small fraction of the iron we added was needed. We produced this short-term response with a temporal decoupling of production and export, but there was no ecosystem restructuring, and the carbon export was largely unresolved. And there were small-scale experiments. They may have been over 50 to 100 kilometers squared, but that was relatively small scale, and we weren't able to account for large boundary effects or look at the large-scale feedbacks. So by about the mid-2000s, we then decided to devote our efforts to natural iron fertilization, to focus on regions of the Southern Ocean which we thought were fertilized by natural sources of iron. And one of these regions was the Kerguelen Plateau, shown here in this panel at the bottom. This is an island it's a series of islands on the Kerguelen Plateau. We have Kerguelen Island in the north, and then Hurd and McDonald Island in the south, with a plateau of about 600 meters depth in between. It's in the Indian sector of the Southern Ocean, somewhere sort of halfway between Africa, Australia, and equidistant from Antarctica as well. And we were able to observe these large phytoplankton blooms downstream of the Kerguelen Plateau here from our satellite imagery. So we decided to conduct an experiment in this region, the first of which was known as Cheops-1, then we followed it up in 2011 with Cheops-2, with the motivation to examine effects of persistent natural ion inputs and to the observed carbon export in a mature ecosystem, and also to observe the larger scales, so some 35,000 kilometers squared over a time period of about 3 months when we were able to undertake these observations. And both these Cheops experiments, Cheops-1 and Cheops-2, were conducted as French-Australian projects in 1995, should be 2005 and 2011. Both Geotrace's process studies. So some results from the first Cheops experiment. This was the bloom we observed on the plateau. This is the Kerguelen line here. This is the plateau to the southeast. And in the bottom panel here, we see the dissolved ion concentrations in blue, where this is the deep ocean concentration upstream of the plateau, so essentially a control station. And in red, we see the dissolved ion concentration on the plateau. So we've demonstrated here that there's a deep iron-rich reservoir above the plateau. We were able to show that deep iron reservoir resulted this large phytoplankton bloom above the plateau, but we weren't able to resolve the roles of winter mixin or lateral advection offstream of the plateau. And importantly, in an iron budget we did for that experiment, we could not show that iron supply could be met by demand. So we were missing a key iron supply term in order to close our iron budget based on the biological demand. So we went back to the same study region in 2011 on Cheops-2 with a specific focus of looking at this region downstream of the Kerguelen Plateau. Most of the fronts come from left to right. The polar front passes very close to the Kerguelen Island here, carries on here. So we wanted to see any iron transported along with the polar fronts. We wanted to understand the different modes of iron delivery to close this budget so the supply could meet the demand, and use our findings to predict future changes to natural iron fertilization in the Southern Ocean. So this animation shows the chlorophyll concentration, satellite chlorophyll, during our study period. In 2011, you'll see by about November, we've got a very high concentrations of chlorophyll downstream of the plateau. I'll just replay that a little bit here. So it starts off in August, so essentially late winter, through into spring, and then when we were in the region by early November, you'll see this very large mosaic of blooms downstream of the plateau to the east of the island. So we were able to observe that by satellite, also by observations in the study region. So this gives you a bit of information on the circulation of the region. We had our reference station upstream of the plateau here, our plateau station here, and our plume station here. And this shows the physical oceanography in the bottom panel here. And the key take home here is the polar front passes just below the Kerguelen Island, and then passes to the north and then around to the south again. And we have this key mixing zone here, which is where we had our plume station. And so we believe that most of the waters in blue here didn't hold very little iron was supplied from the plateau, but the waters passing up here and around into the green mixing area, based on the circulation and hydrography, were believed to receive that iron off the plateau. And we saw that. So this is dissolved iron at the reference station. Note the different scales here, 0 to 0.6 nanomoles per litre. Different concentrations on the plateau are higher levels, mostly at depth, up to 1.5 nanomoles per litre, just above the shelf. And then in the plume, so downstream of that region, also higher concentration of dissolved iron. But the key thing here is in the blue squares, this is particulate iron. So the red lines show dissolved iron, the blue squares show particulate iron. And we see that in our plume station, downstream of the Kerguelen Plateau, we had much higher concentrations of particulate iron. That was a key finding from that experiment. We were able to produce this iron budget for the region. So looking west to east, we have our Kerguelen Plateau. We were able to estimate that some 148 micromoles of iron per meter squared was present above our plateau. In our region immediately downstream of that, we have lower concentration of iron because this region wasn't subjected to currents that have come off the plateau. As I say, they went to the north and then around to the south again. But further downstream in our plume, we have this elevated dissolved iron concentration here. And you can see where the currents went based on the ocean temperature. So the warmer waters here north of the polar front are associated with these elevated iron concentrations. And we published this work from Cheops 1 in 2007, the effect of natural iron fertilization on carbon sequestration in the Southern Ocean, with follow-up articles in the journal Deep Sea Research 2. I was able to put together a budget for iron for Cheops 2, an iron budget for the region. For the first time, we were able to constrain all the different source, sink terms, and internal cycling. So the vertical terms from below, we were able to measure the vertical diffusivity, and therefore calculate the amount of iron supplied by below by the gradient in the iron concentration. We're able to look at upwelling burst on vertical velocity, entrainment based on the differences between the summer and the winter mixed layer depth and the iron concentrations in the different seasons. We were able to look at lateral advection using horizontal current velocities and geostrophic velocities. And we were able to look at atmospheric deposition using a station on Covalent Island itself. The sinks, we were able to look at the export of dissolved iron using free floating sediment traps, which were deployed directly below the plume, and then using thorium-234 and iron to thorium ratios to work out the export of iron. We were able to look at uptake through phytoplankton deckboard radiotracer experiments, and we were able to look at remineralization through similar grazer experiments on the ship, and also some individual work from some lab experiments. And what we're able to find, well, we can compare our plateau station with our plume station, and we'll see in our plateau station, it is largely the atmospheric supply of iron from above and some from below, which supplies most of the dissolved iron, particularly through upwelling and entrainment. We have a large amount of uptake of dissolved iron, but a very small amount of remineralization. And a large amount of that dissolved iron was exported to depth. In our plume station, it's a different story. Most of the iron is supplied laterally from the plateau in currents downstream of Kerguelen. Again, we have this high amount of iron which is uptaken and very little remineralization. And we have a small amount of iron exported because most of it was retained within the mixed layer. So these budgets incorporated all the source and sink and internal recycling mechanisms of iron. We see vertical supply dominates on the plateau, lateral supply dominating the plume. And there is the importance of lateral particulate supply to maintain our bloom, our phytoplankton bloom. And the key thing was that the short-term iron demand, so that the weekly iron demand could be met by the long-term seasonal supply. And that was the way I was able to close out the budget. It was the long-term seasonal supply of iron and the retention of iron within the system that was able to satisfy the short-term iron demand. Okay, so that finishes up part 2 of the experiment. So I'd just like to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about some more recent work we've been undertaking in our lab relating to geotraces and ocean iron biogeochemistry, but taking a little bit of an alternative approach by trying to constrain the amount of iron that is supplied to the climatically important Southern Ocean through the atmosphere. So the atmospheric iron supply to the regions around Australia and specifically south of Australia. And this work was brought about by some observations going back through the millennial drought, which was in Australia between 2001 and 2009. The picture on the top right here shows a dust storm we see in the typical desert regions of Australia. We had a lot of this dust storm activity in this period, brought about by very dry conditions. And we were able to track this dust from the Australian continent over to the ocean. But more recently, we've been seeing the importance of wildfires, known in Australia's bushfires, large bushfires happening in very dry conditions over the summer months, again transported large emissions of smoke and ash and bushfire smoke over the oceans. And we were wanting to try and constrain the importance of these atmospheric sources for ocean iron biogeochemistry. We also had a project in 2016 around Heard Island, which is on the Kerguelen Plateau, as I've mentioned. Heard Island is Australia's only volcanic island. And we had a research expedition looking at the importance of the volcano on Heard Island to the local biogeochemistry there. Now, the key thing with all these studies is that these sort of events, dust uplift and transport, bushfire events and volcanic eruptions, they're all highly episodic and they vary in time and magnitude between years. Very difficult to sample, very difficult to get a baseline time series data to compare to these specific events. And this was identified in a paper in 2019, in Marine Chemistry, which was a workshop report from a dust symposium that happened a couple of years before. Perspectives on identifying and characterizing the processes controlling ion speciation and resonance time at the ocean-ion interface. And one of the recommendations of this workshop was that building new stations that monitor both atmospheric and ocean properties is also necessary. New long-term observing programs should be promoted downwind of dust sources, source areas in the Southern Hemisphere, South Africa, Australia, and South Africa, where observations are very sparse and the ocean ecosystem is expected to be most sensitive to ion inputs based on ion limitation. We knew in the Australian region we had these large dust storms happening most years. This is an event in October 2002. It shows about 5 million tons of dust sediment transported from the Australian continent over the eastern seaboard and into the waters to the east coast of Australia, the Coral Sea and the Tasman Sea. We estimated about 5% of that dust contained iron, and about 1% of that iron would be soluble in the ocean. But a few years later, we also see these large bushfire events in Tasmania, around sort of where we had our stations. And we know from some what we hypothesized from some earlier work that the bushfire, the iron contained within this bushfire smoke may contain much higher solubility. So we knew this was happening. Our satellite images also showed these atmospheric iron sources. This is data from the Global Modeling and Simulation Office, the NASA's GEOS-FP data simulation system. We have an image, a static image from April 2007 in the top left, a static image from January 2020 in the bottom right. And this video here cycles through the 2019 to 2020 austral summer period. And it actually shows when you get to about November, December, the increase of biomass burning and wildfires in Australia. So different colors indicate different sources of dust, different sources of particles in the atmosphere. Sea salt is shown in blue, dust is shown in orange, specifically looking at some of these major dust sources around Africa here. You can see the large dust plumes coming out of the Sahara region here. Nitrate is shown in pink, sulfate in green, and carbon or black carbon is shown in red, indicating the biomass burning. So as you'll see, we've got some of these biomass burning sources happening in South Africa, South America, and as we move into the sort of October, November period here, we're in November 2019, we see these bushfire events increasing in Australia, and we had these massive bushfire events in the 2019-2020 season, which transported large amounts of black carbon and biomass and ash from Australia over the Pacific Ocean, but critically quite far south to the Southern Ocean part of the Pacific, where the ecosystems were probably limited by the element iron. Some work I'll show you shortly, we're actually able to link phytoplankton growth in this region to these bushfire events, shown by the red plumes coming off the eastern coast of Australia there. Okay, so what did we do as part of to sort of address some of these work questions? Well, about sort of 6 years ago now, I set up an integrated ocean and atmosphere series of time series projects. So this is the Australian continent here. The dots show and the arrows show the major atmospheric pathways from Australia to the northwest, the major one to the southeast, and also one off the southwest coast of Australia. We set up a station in Western Australia here at a site called Gingin. This is an atmospheric sampler, a high vol sampler that was able to collect particles on a filter on a weekly basis. We also set up a station here in Kunani, Mount Wellington, which is just north of Hobart, able to look at the southeast dust plume. And we've had various research voyages around the Australian continent, but also some more focused projects up here in Queensland and also in the Northern Territory to look at the atmospheric supply of trace elements and try to link that with ocean productivity. So focusing on the Koonami Mount Wellington time series here, just north of Hobart, this has been going since 2016. It's a continuous monitoring of atmospheric background and also episodic weather events or bushfire events, dust events. It provides a station at the gateway to the high nutrient oracle of Southern Ocean, and it also tracks this Australian southeast dust path. So we've been collecting more or less weekly since 2016. We set up a new analytical method in order to constrain the iron in these atmospheric particles. So we had a weak leach here consisting of millicue. We had a sort of mild acid leach here, and we had a stronger leach here. And through these different leaches of these particles, we were able to measure what we termed a soluble fraction, a labile fraction, and also the refractory fraction. And adding all three together will give us the total ion concentration. So that was the methods we devised. This is the data. So this is from the Koonami Mount Wellington time series, going back to 2016 to the year 2020. And vertical bars indicate individual data points. And the differences in colors, the orange bars are the samples that were impacted by fire events. So we were able to use a tracer called leafoglucosan. It's a sugar, and leafoglucosan can indicate where there's been presence of biomass burning, fire events impacted on the sample. And when we had a leafoglucosan concentration greater than 10, that was indicated of fire events. And these are the concentrations of total iron in the top panel, labile iron in the bottom panel. And we see where there's fire, we have greater concentrations of both total and labile iron in our samples. We were able to look at the seasonal patterns. So this is the same data, but plotted in a seasonal way. So we have going left to right, autumn, spring, summer, and in the white box here, these are the events or the samples that were impacted by fire. So we see that the fire samples have a greater overall concentration of total iron, but also a greater concentration of the labile bioavailable iron. And also, interestingly, these fire events tend to have a greater concentration of mineral dust, and I'll come to that shortly. We focused on two specific seasons in our most recent paper, the 2018-2019 summer season, where there were large bushfires in Tasmania, and compared that to the 2019 to 2020 season, where the fires were mostly located on the Australian continent, the mainland, but were far greater magnitude. So in this way, we were able to compare our non-fire signal with our proximal fire, so the Tasmanian fires close to our station here on Mount Wellington, with our distal fire sources, where the fires were located several thousands of kilometers away. And what can we see? Well, we see that in both the proximal and distal fires, we see an increase in atmospheric total iron, but also nitrate and ammonia concentrations. Specifically, the nutrients increase quite dramatically in our distal fires, or ones that are a large distance away from the source. We see an increase in the labile concentration of iron and also the solubility. So as the particles tend to be transported further distances away from the source, they become more soluble due to atmospheric processing. And we're also interested to see these high concentrations of mineral dust in our fire samples too, indicating that it isn't just the bushfire smoke resulting in these higher concentrations of iron and nutrients. It is likely mineral dust that's entrained in the fire burning processes and uplifted into the atmosphere that also is responsible from these higher observations. So I'm coming to the end of the talk now. So we put some of this data, we work with some modelers here and overseas, and these are some of the outputs of these models. We were able to compare our Koonami Mount Wellington time series data with a multi-model mean. Again, we see the different seasons, spring, summer, and autumn, and in the with the purple colors being the observations and the reddish colors being the model, and we're able to see that largely the models underestimated the observations across all the seasons, but particularly in terms of iron solubility. So for total iron, you actually see that the median for the model isn't so different to the median for the observations across the different seasons, including the fire season. But if you look at the solubility, the models tended to underpredict the solubility of iron. Again, we were able to use a different type of model to look at the relative contributions of fire and dust and anthropogenic emissions to our particles found in these different locations. And we were able to work, again, with some modelers here to look at our observations and look at the model prior to the input of our observations with them afterwards. And we see that we've been improving the outputs of these observations through this generation of new data for atmospheric ion sources in the southern hemisphere. And finally, just finishing up, this is a paper we published this year in the journal Nature. This is a satellite image of the black carbon plume, the fire plume coming off Australia into the South Pacific Ocean. This is a satellite imagery, or this is satellite imagery of atmospheric black carbon, again over Australia here. These is where the bushfires were. And this on the right-hand side is a satellite observation of chlorophyll pigments. And interestingly, we saw this anomalous increase in chlorophyll or phytoplankton biomass in this region of the South Pacific Ocean, downstream of where our fire events occurred in 2019-2020. We looked at historical climatology for the region, going back to 2004. And we see that there were peaks during summer in the black carbon atmospheric optical depth, but nothing compared to the 2019-20 season, where we see this very high anomaly, which also coincided with an anomaly in the chlorophyll concentration in the South Pacific Ocean. So the satellite observations show the elevated black carbon from the fires resulting in elevated chlorophyll in the Pacific Southern Ocean. We were able to model that. This is a work of a student of mine, just soon published here. We were able to model that against the black carbon deposition, but also importantly, the dust deposition, which happened afterwards. And we were able to see that the black carbon, or the iron in the black carbon, stimulated the phytoplankton growth initially, but we believe it was the dust that was also entrained into those emissions, which resulted in the longevity of the chlorophyll and longevity of the bloom, as you can see, going on to either June or July of 2020. So it was the additional iron supplied by desert dust that was deposited in early and mid 2020, which resulted in the longevity of that bloom. And that comes to the sort of conclusion of my talk. I'll finish up with a few dot points. First of all, the studies of naturally iron fertilized areas have shed new light on long-term continuous iron fertilization of the Southern Ocean. We have investigated the effect of natural iron fertilization both through internal sources and through sources from above, from the atmosphere, at spatial and temporal scales that have not been explored in the past. We have taken advantage of the complexity of the system to explore the variability of the ecosystem-driven responses of the Southern Ocean to change in iron supply. We believe that the high carbon sequestration efficiency may not be obtainable through these purposeful ocean geoengineering proposals due to the complex interplay between the ocean physics, iron and carbon cycles, but that long-term atmospheric monitoring stations are essential to enhance our understanding of the alien supply of vital nutrients in marine ecosystems. And the Geotraces program has provided a platform to revolutionize our understanding of the role of trace elements and isotopes in Earth's biogeochemical cycles. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thanks all for your time and for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Andrew Bowie, for your nice talk highlighting the importance of the Geotraces program, and also highlighting the biogeochemistry, in particular the iron biogeochemistry of the Southern Ocean, and role of atmospheric dust and wildfires on supplying iron to the ocean. So we would like to move to the next session now, which is the question and answer session. So I would now like to invite Dr. Durga Prasad to conduct the Q&A session. So the floor is open for question and answers.
Thank you, Vinith. Thank you, Dr. Andrew, for a very interesting talk. So we have the viewers both from YouTube as well as a panel from Webex. So first of all, let us take the questions from YouTube. Then we'll come to Webex panel. So the first question is from Dr. Neeraj Rastogi. He wants to know what could be the possible roles in terms of grazing or eating and excreting of zooplanktons and sea animals in converting the insoluble iron from dust into bioavailable iron. So this, he says, that is related to the slide shown from Tagliabue et al. 2017.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a really good question, and it's a part of the, I guess, the biological cycle of iron which hasn't been explored in very much detail to date. More groups are looking at that now, and in terms of obviously, if iron goes through photosynthesis, iron is taken up, it goes into phytoplankton, they're grazed upon by larger zooplankton, etc. It goes up through the food chain. At some point, those higher trophic levels will die, and some of the iron contained within them will be excreted or be regenerated into the system. So we do believe that's an important source of recycled iron in some systems. We've done some work here looking at the role of Antarctic krill in accumulating iron. Krill feed on phytoplankton, they accumulate in their system, and eventually krill are eaten by whales. So we've done some work there on looking at how iron's accumulated in the system. That could also be a way of transporting iron to different regions. It's in terms of quantifying how important those internal recycling sources through grazing would be compared with new sources of iron. That's difficult to say. I wouldn't like to put say one is more important than the other. I guess the important point to make is that sources of dust and bushfires, etc., they're new sources of iron. So they're iron that's been brought into the ocean from a landmass, from a continent that hasn't been present in the ocean before, whereas iron that is recycled through zooplankton or higher trophic levels is iron that's already in the system, but it's just being recycled through the system. So that new iron might be more important overall in that it's providing new iron to a system that wasn't there before. Did that answer some of your question? In terms of the bioavailable iron, probably the iron from the recycled sources is more bioavailable than the iron from the dust. We know that low solubility in dust, but the iron coming from these bioavailable sources, they'd be within sort of acid contents of internal, organisms of these animals. It's probably much more bioavailable to phytoplankton when it's released.
There's another question from Dr. Neeraj Rastogi. When EF of iron was similar for fire and non-fire conditions, how do you say that fires are the significant source of iron?
So the EF is the enrichment factor of iron, and we saw it was similar in the fire and non-fire sources, but the enrichment factors we used in our calculations were to show whether the iron was it shows where the iron is largely from continental sources, so largely from crustal materials. So we use aluminium as our normalizer in those calculations. So simplify, how do you say that fire is a significant source of iron? So I think the key thing there is that whilst the enrichment factor of iron was similar in the fire and the non-fire sources, they were much greater than, go back up the slide, than the iron in the, where are we going now? Yeah, so the enrichment factor, was similar, but the actual concentration of iron, so the enrichment factor is used to trace where the iron's coming from, and we weren't able to do that. We weren't able to differentiate between the non-fire and proximal iron forces based on our enrichment factor, but we do know we had the higher concentration of mineral dust, both in our proximal and distant iron sources. It's more likely the fact that you get these increases in solubility of iron in the distal sources that increases the amount of iron being deposited in these distal fire events. But yeah, it's true to say that the enrichment factor didn't show that there was it wasn't just where the source of the iron was coming from. It was the reason behind the differences here. I'll explain that well. It wasn't just the enrichment factor, which is trying to highlight where the source of the iron wasn't responsible for the high iron concentration of 676 and 70 nanograms per meter cubed in our total iron in our fire sources compared with our non-fire sources. I hope I answered that reasonably well.
Thank you. The next question is from Dr. Bhaskar Mukherjee. He wants to know the lowest detection level of the trace element database.
Yeah, it's good, very good question, and it would depend entirely on the element you're looking at. So I think I said there was something like 507 different trace elements and isotopes. And obviously within, one element may have many different parameters. For example, iron, you have iron 2, iron 3, you have ligand bound iron, particulate iron at different size fractions. The actual lowest value would depend on that particular element, and some of the probably some of the rare earth elements and some of the more exotic type elements would have the lowest detection level. In parts per trillion for sure. I'd have to actually go into the Geotrace's IDP to find the very lowest value, but they'll certainly be down at those parts per trillion concentrations.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have no more questions from YouTube. So we'll now move on to the Webex panel. So anybody from a Webex panel has any query or question?
Well, Dr. Durga Prasad, can I ask
Yes, sir.
a couple of questions?
Yeah, Professor Deshpande wants to ask. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Professor Andrew, at the outset, I thank you for providing such a nice overview of the activities under the Geotraces. And I have a couple of questions. The first question is that what is the mechanism underlying persistent phytoplankton bloom? You said that it lasted for more than 6 weeks. That's what you said. So what is the mechanism, and can we understand that in terms of residence time or sustenance time, that it would last for 6 weeks or 8 weeks? Why not 12 weeks? Why only 6 weeks? This is my first question.
Yeah. Okay. Great question. So the point I made at the time is really unexpected that the bloom would last that long. We expected that after we stopped supplying iron, the phytoplankton bloom would rapidly run out of that limited resource and eventually decay and some of the carbon be exported. But it did seem to persist for at least 6 weeks. We believe that was due to several factors. One hint we were given was the shape of this bloom. So we were in an eddy of the Southern Ocean. We believe that the actual stirring of this bloom was able to entrain laterally some extra nutrients from the side, so extra nitrate and phosphate and silicate, to just keep the supply of those major nutrients going. We believe the phytoplankton themselves were able to recycle the nutrients within the phytoplankton bloom, or either that or they took up more iron than they needed at the start of the bloom. So luxury uptake, that's known as. So they take up more iron than they need. When they run short, they've got some in reserve. And the third part of the question, why did it last 6 weeks? Well, we're going into this image was taken on the 23rd of March 1999. So we're going into autumn, austral autumn. And by this stage, you'll see the grey here is the cloud cover. So by this stage, we're rapidly running out of light. So while some of the nutrients and the iron might have still persisted, the phytoplankton were probably running out of light at that time of year as we go into the autumn, and that resulted in probably the end of that phytoplankton bloom. But it's the most surprising thing for the longevity and why these iron fertilization experiments can persist is this unexpected recycling of iron within the system.
Thank you. I have next question regarding this natural fertilization near Kerguelen Plateau. So from the satellite imagery, we see that the iron which is released is just localized. It is viewed on a larger perspective like a point source. Why doesn't it get advected and get turned into some kind of filamentous structure? What is the reason why it is focused there only?
Yeah, I think that the image I've got on the screen sort of shows the best of that. I mean, you can see it's you can see the Kerguelen in there. They're tiny. I mean, they're relatively small islands. You get this massive mosaic of blooms downstream of the islands. It is the physics that's controlling the shape of that. And I think when I showed this animation of the chlorophyll during the experiment, you'll see that by the end of October, about now, it suddenly explodes, and you don't tend to get like a filament. It tends to be a mosaic of different blooms, and it is a really good question. Why doesn't it seem to be a coherent bloom? I'm certain it's connected to the physics, and the physics is largely driven by the bathymetry around this region. So you've got the islands, you've got the shelf, it's about 600 meters deep, then you've got deeper water masses, and that controls the physical currents. And I think they largely control the shape of the bloom. It's the mixing of those different water masses which result in the different shape of the phytoplankton blooms.
Right. Thank you. My next question is about the dust, wildfire, and volcanoes being three sources of iron. So, in your opinion, how would you give the relative importance to these three things? And how do we perceive these three processes from the futuristic or predictability point of view? Because volcanoes are absolutely unpredictable, then wildfires are maybe a little more predictable, and then the dust could even be seasonal phenomena. So, how would you, how one, a non-expert, grasp these processes?
Yeah, that's absolutely a superb question. Trying to predict, I guess, yeah, the sort of the magnitude and the frequency of these events in the future. I mean, just in a yeah, from an Australian perspective, we had very dry summers. We went through largely El Nino conditions up until 2020, and most summers there were large bushfires, also large dust storms, which tend to happen regardless of the season. But when you have El Nino conditions, you have drier soil, lower water content in the soil, so you tend to have more dry material being uplifted. But since 2020, we've shifted to mostly La Nina conditions. We've had very wet summers, so we're not seeing the bushfires, or we're not seeing the dust depositions. But in the future, we probably will see that. It's a good question to try to predict how. My thoughts, my hypotheses are that the importance of wildfires and dust deposition are going to become more important in the future. To what extent, I don't really know. Volcanoes, as you say, are more episodic. The particular volcanoes we studied was relatively small, but there's many volcanoes around the globe of much larger magnitude, and it's been shown that they are sources of iron too. But I think in the future, I guess to summarize, the atmospheric supply of iron from above is going to be a much more of a dominant source in the future than it has been in the past, due to the change in Earth's sort of climatic balance and due to there being drier, more arid, hotter conditions.
Thank you. Dr. Durga, I have two more questions, but I suggest that let other panelists ask, and if the time permits, I will ask two more questions.
Okay, sir. I can see Dr. Waliur Rahman has a question. He raised the hand. So, Dr. Rahman.
Hi, this is Waliur Rahman from Polar Institute, Goa. We measure dust in Antarctic ice core, and one of the publications that last year we published in Asia. So basically, it's an Antarctic ice core dust record from the East Antarctica, and that is the last 100 years record from 1905 to 2013. So it's almost 100 years, which shows that there is a several fold, means up to 5-fold increase in dust depositional flux in the Atlantic sector. Means we are getting the high dust record since almost 1980. So and not only our our record, there are also other records from the East Antarctica, which also shows there is a significant increase in dust depositional flux. So and we have a very good observation of the dust deposition based on the satellite since '79, which also shows there is an increase in dust deposition, means production as well as deposition. And these dust are coming from the South America, Patagonia. So my question is, in the recent almost 3-4 decades, we have seen significant increase in dust deposition in the, at least in the Atlantic sector, I would say. So my question is, we have a very good chlorophyll record of since '79 based on the satellite. So do you see the corresponding change in the chlorophyll concentration, particularly in the Atlantic sector or elsewhere? If anybody has checked that, I don't know. So this is a good window actually to check to test the hypothesis whether the dust increase is actually seen in the or the response seen in the chlorophyll concentration increase. So this is one of the good opportunity to test. So we do not have time series record of in the water column trace element iron concentration, but we have a since 79 based on the satellite we have dust, we have a dust chlorophyll. So and then this dust concentration is also going to increase because the circumwesterly is also increased because of the TAM is going to sit in the positive, means it's there in the positive. So circumwesterly is also increasing. So my question is whether there is do you see any corresponding increase in the chlorophyll concentration, or if it is so, then do you expect an increase in chlorophyll concentration in future because dust is going to increase in, let's say, in coming decades?
So I think I couldn't quite hear the question, but was it that do you expect that the chlorophyll concentration in the ocean will increase because of the increased dust from South America close to Antarctica? Is that the question?
Yes, at least in the Atlantic sector. Atlantic
sector, yeah. So obviously, as you've highlighted there, the Patagonia and the South American regions are very important sources of dust. And there was a symposium last week on actually focusing specifically on dust to the southern hemisphere, and a lot of researchers from that region. I guess what I'm thinking is close to the Antarctic continent, there's multiple sources of iron. Iron can be released from glaciers melting. It can be released through sea ice that tends to store iron during the winter. When sea ice melts, it releases iron. So phytoplankton blooms often occur at the Antarctic margin and at the edge of the Antarctic sea ice as it melts. They may or may not be as a result of atmospheric supply of iron, because it may be some of these other sources. But certainly, I think dust will have a role because, as you've said, dust has been observed to accumulate in the ice, in the Antarctic ice, but it also accumulates in the sea ice. Dust transported from these regions will settle on the sea ice when it's present and will be released during spring when it melts. So I would expect there to be resulting phytoplankton blooms from that, but tracing exactly where the iron comes from might be a more difficult thing. You'd have to use some trace element ratios or some isotopic fingerprinting to maybe do that. I hope I've answered the question there.
No, but then that is not in the coastal region. It's far away from the, even in the, let's say, dust is all the way from the Patagonia to, it's not on the coastal Antarctica. It's far away from the open ocean, open southern ocean, I would say.
Right. So the link there might be more conclusive, and I have seen some work recently where people have seen phytoplankton blooms in that region and they've linked it to Patagonian dust supply. I guess the important thing is that when dust or bushfires are entrained into the atmosphere, they're transported many thousands of kilometers, very long distances, and often are deposited long way, far distances from where they're sourced. We saw from the Australian bushfires, the effects of the biomass was observed in the South Pacific Ocean, closer to South America. So it's again depending on the local meteorology, whether the dust and the bushfires in the atmosphere is going to be deposited locally or many thousands of kilometers from the source. But I would expect that some of that Patagonian dust would have an effect on the chlorophyll in Drake's Passage and the region of the Atlantic to the southeast of South America.
Now we'll move on to the next question from Professor Sunil Singh. Professor Sunil, you may ask the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Andrew, for giving a nice overview of dissolved iron in Southern Ocean. Actually, my question is, I have seen your data, this iron in Southern Ocean, and some of the concentrations seem to be quite high, and particularly some of the export fluxes and some of the input advection fluxes are significantly higher. So what will be the role of some of this Southern Ocean water or Southern source iron to the Northern Indian Ocean iron budget?
So nice to see you, Professor Sunil. I guess we're talking about some of the data from the Kirkland study where we've seen these high iron data. We believe that most of that iron will be locally transported, or very, relative terms, quite local transport. They're mostly transported to the east in the polar front. What we have seen in some of their other studies is the role of the Southeast Indian Ridge and hydrothermal iron being as yet unobserved source of iron. We've seen very strong sources of iron from hydrothermal ridges, some 2 to 3 nanomoles or above, much greater than you'd find in the surface Southern Ocean. Where that iron will be transported again will be dependent on the global thermohaline circulation, but it's feasible that some of where we've seen it south of Australia, there's also likely to be many more hydrothermal sources from the Southeast Indian Ridge further to the east and further to the west, in the Indian parts of the Southern Ocean, and that could well be a more important source of iron to the Northern Indian Ocean than we haven't seen so far.
Okay, because our observation shows that very little is coming from Southern Ocean. If you see the Antarctic intermediate water is carrying very less amount of iron. So it means all the iron which is locally showing high concentration, they are being utilized in the Southern Ocean itself. They are not able to go up to Indian Ocean or Northern Indian Ocean.
I would have thought it's probably more atmospheric sources from the continents surrounding the Northern Indian Ocean, which are the major supply actually of iron there, rather than from internally from the south.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sunil, and thank you, Andrew. Now, I think Dr. Gyanranjan Tripathi has a question. Dr. Gyana, you can.
Hi, thank you, Dilda. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Hi, Professor Andrew. Thank you for this nice presentation. I have one concern that many of the geological records, they do show that the wildfire events, whenever there is a charcoal record or something, we do see there is a biocrisis. And many of the time they have been linked to, very decline in some productivity. Sometimes that has been linked to mass extinction events also. So in this case, when you say that there is a wildfire in Australia which led to a government enrichment, is it because it's a small pulse of wildfire and may not have sustained for a long period of time? Because overall, the wildfire, the toxic gases, they are going to, on a long term, they are going to have a adverse effect on the productivity rather than supporting the productivity. Am I missing something?
So I think I understood there that in some, it's been observed previously some of the effects of wildfires on ocean productivity have actually been to lower the productivity of ocean regions. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because the constituents of those. So that's, I mean, you could obviously particles and elements contained within a bushfire. There'll be obviously those that are toxic to marine phytoplankton, as well as those that are needed for productivity, as well as the micronutrients. I guess it would depend on what the particular constituents of those bushfires would be. In our case, we believe it was the mixing of the bushfire emissions with dust, which was also entrained into the bloom, which provided this higher iron content, so higher total iron concentration, and that total iron was made more soluble by the atmospheric processing of acids, etc., that were contained within the bushfire emissions. The study where we were able to link the Australian bushfires to the phytoplankton response in the South Pacific, we did that in a number of different ways. We also used biogeochemical Argo floats to try to link the ocean productivity as well as a satellite observation. So we're fairly confident in that. My take would be it would really depend on what the constituents of the different wildfire events may be and their impact on the ocean productivity, and also whether the marine region was primed for being more susceptible to fertilization. So if the region that we studied, for example, had a high nitrate, had phytoplankton reserve stock, but was just missing iron, and there was sufficient iron from the bushfires, but there wasn't anything that was toxic to the phytoplankton, that would stimulate the bloom, and that's what we observed. But I guess it would depend on the source, the nature of the source, and also the nature of where that source of iron was, or where the source of the bushfires was deposited in the marine ecosystem. That's
I
all
think
right.
it is mostly linked to iron only because maybe the particular reason is limited with iron, but on a large scale oceans, you want to expand, then probably it's not about iron itself, unless it is limited in that reason.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's probably not just to do with iron. I mean, as we've seen here, we've also provided nitrate and in some cases ammonia to the, and that's only, we only looked at a few different elements there. So it's probably not just iron in the bloom, which is resulting in the effect on the marine ecosystems, other constituents too. As we've seen with dust, dust is not just a supply of iron, it's also a supply of nutrients. And in the North Atlantic, we see the important roles of nitrogen supply from above.
Thank you. Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Vineet, you may ask your question.
Yeah, so I'm just curious to know that generally we talk about dust being a source of iron, dissolution of dust in the ocean and supplying iron to the regions where iron supply is limited. So what about other sources of iron? For example, hydrothermal iron, if it is laterally advected and upwelling of that iron into the maybe surface or subsurface water, and also from the shelf regions, which how significant that contribution would be.
Yeah, so the Geotrace's work has largely shown that the shelf supply of iron is mostly utilized close to the shelf break. So you don't generally get large transport of dissolved iron into the interior major ocean basins. Some particles are transported that way. In some oxygen minimum zones, because they change the redox speciation of iron, you can get more of a penetration of iron off a shelf break in low oxygen waters further offshore. But generally, you know, particularly rivers, iron tends to flocculate in the estuary, doesn't tend to be transported to the ocean, and even the shelf supplied iron probably doesn't get transported far into the deep ocean. It is largely the atmospheric supply which is going to supply those remote regions. Hydrothermal vents are important. They are a strong source of iron, but there's got to be some mechanism for transporting that hydrothermal iron, which is often down at 2,000 meters or more below the sea surface, into the surface for an effect to happen. Now that may be global thermohaline circulation, and maybe local eddies that transport in deeper waters up. But often that hydrothermal iron will probably remain in deeper waters. And around the continents, around the polar regions in the Antarctic and the Arctic, they're strong sources of iron, particularly seasonally. And probably as Antarctica continues to melt, that's going to be an even more important source of iron to the polar regions. And the roles of melting glaciers are probably going to become even more important and may stimulate more southern ocean productivity because of the iron they release.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I don't see any raised hands here. So before moving on to Professor Deshpande ji, so I request any other member from the panel, Webex panel, has any other question? If not, we move on to Professor Deshpande. Sir, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Professor Andrew, I have one question, maybe very naive, that you discussed about three major events. One was about this millennium drought, which was from 2001 to 2009. And then second was about this Tasmanian bushfire, which was in 1920. And third was about this Mozambique eruption in 2016. And then you also showed that this Australian wildfire, its impression was seen far in the Pacific Southern Ocean. So these other two events also had its impression somewhere far away, or not?
Yes. So we were able to track the Tasmanian bushfires in 2018-19 to New Zealand. We measured them, and they were observed in some of the New Zealand glaciers. And the volcanic eruptions we tracked from measurements made aboard a research vessel, but we were able to see, in terms of some other trace element tracers, we were able to see the effect of the volcanic eruption from Mawson several hundreds of kilometers away. What the difference is, I think, between the major bushfires on the Australian continent in 2019-20 and the other two events, the Tasmanian bushfires and the volcanic eruption, was the magnitude of the emissions were much lower from the last two. So the magnitude of the emissions from the Australian mainland bushfires was much greater, much more bushfires, covered a much larger area of burnt area, much more dust entrained in that. So the impact on the marine ecosystem was larger. But all three events had effects far away from their source.
Right. And the associated query or comment is that if there is an area, any area which is commonly affected by all these three events, because your three events are temporally exclusive, they are in different time, they are not overlapping in terms of time. So therefore, it might provide very interesting observations that in the common area, how these three events have made some impact. So would you like to comment if on some common area, how these three different events impacted?
Do you mean whether they impacted the same area?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. Well, because of the atmospheric transport pathways, the Tasmanian bushfires and the mainland Australian bushfires would have impacted the same area to the southeast of Australia. But as I said, it's really depends on the local meteorology on where the dust and bushfires that's up in the atmosphere is actually deposited into the ocean. And in the Tasmanian bushfires, we weren't able to, because they were a smaller size, we weren't able to actually conclusively find where that bushfire smoke was transported to the land. We knew it was partly over New Zealand, but we weren't able to track the ocean region where it was deposited, largely because of the size of it. It was much smaller. But I guess, yeah, in terms of the common area, it is mostly the Pacific sector of the Southern Ocean that's going to be impacted. So the areas for Australia, downwind of Australia to the southeast, following the atmospheric transport pathways. For South Africa, it's going to be largely the Indian sector of the Southern Ocean. Again, the predominantly atmospheric transport pathways are to the south and to the east, and from, as the earlier questioner said, from Patagonia in South America, it's going to be the region of the South Atlantic Ocean and the Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean. It's going to be impacted.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrew. I'm indeed enriched with your information. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for your questions.
So thank you, Professor Andrew. Yeah, thank you. So any other member from the Webex panel would like to ask any question? It seems that there are no further questions from the Webex panel. However, we have couple of questions from the YouTube again, so we'll take it up. So one of the question is from Dr. Bhaskar Mukherjee. So he was asking whether the database, probably which you have mentioned, Geotraces, is available online.
Yes, it is, and so it's publicly available. There is no registration step. If you want to use the data, you just need to agree to a data usage agreement. And I'll show you the link there. The link is at the bottom of the screen. If you go to geotraces.org, that's the homepage, there'll be a link directly from there to this landing page, which is hosted by the British Oceanographic Data Centre. And this has the Geotraces Intermediate Data Product landing page. And as I say, there's different ways you can access the intermediate data product, whether you want to just your own subset of data, whether you want the full digital data set, or whether you want to look at some of these electronic images and look at the electronic atlas. So that's available now, yes.
Thank you. So Dr. Somkumar Sharma wants to know what would be the impact of cloud cover?
Good question. Impact of cloud cover on ion supply from the atmosphere?
Probably yes.
Yeah. Probably yes. So a lot of the problems with cloud cover is satellites don't see through clouds generally. So it's a lot of the getting the information on, for example, where atmospheric dust and bushfires have been transported is difficult when there's cloud cover. But in terms of if there's cloudiness in the atmosphere and you have bushfire emissions and dust, often one way to transfer particles out of the atmosphere is through precipitation, so through rain events. So if there is cloud cover and it's the altitude of the cloud cover would be the similar altitude to the altitude of the bushfire emission, then you might well have precipitation from the cloud that would transfer those particles into the ocean. That could be one effect.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrew, for taking up all the questions and patiently answering. And we don't have any further questions. So over to Vineet for further proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Durga Prasad, for nicely conducting the question and answer session. I would like to now invite Dr. Manas Samal for the final session. That is the vote of thanks and conclusion of this 17th PRL Kamrit Vyakhyaan.
Thank you, Vineet. Friends, it is an honor to propose vote of thanks to all who have helped us in making today's Vyakhyaan possible. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Andrew for accepting our invitation and agreeing to share his knowledge and experience with us. Professor Andrew, we are truly thankful to you for delivering a compact overview of various aspects of marine biochemistry and geotraces from history to recent advances, and showing us many exciting and interesting results obtained from various experiments. Once again, I thank you for your time and a thought-provoking Vyakhyaan. I also thank Professor Anil Bharadwaj, Director PRL, Professor Pallam Raju, Dean PRL, and all the Vyakhyaan committee members for their continuous efforts to make this Vyakhyaan series keep going. Finally, on behalf of PRL, I would like to extend our special thanks to all our participants, panelists who have joined us through Webex and YouTube platforms. Thank you all for your time. With this, we come to the very end of today's chapter of PRL Amrut Vyakhyaan. Hope to see you next week with another yet interesting Vyakhyaan. Till then, goodbye to you all. Have a great evening. Thank you.